Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in.
Okay, happy Saturday everybody. First up, the big news this week on the financial side of things is that Chinese stocks across the board surged in their best performance since the global financial crisis in 2008, the CSI 300 jumping almost 16% this week, finally bringing the index into the green year on year. However, it still remains at a 5-year low. The Golden Dragon Index, which is made up of companies with shares traded on the US stock exchange, but conduct the majority of their business in China, jumped as much as 13% on Thursday, the most intraday since March 2022. Some are optimistic. Scott Ribner of Goldman Sachs, in a note to clients on Thursday, for example, wrote that despite the rally, the long-awaited recovery in Chinese equities may finally have arrived, and if so, investors should want to get in on it. Quote, "I really think this time is different for China," end quote, noting that being underweight Chinese equities is the, quote, "largest consensus trade," end quote, in the global stock market. Adding, quote, "Re-emerging markets have quickly become a favored post-US election trade for November and December," end quote. Others have cautioned that next week marks the 75th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China, and that Beijing has a track record of pumping up the stock market on the eve of important dates to create a sense of excitement with households during the period. So what triggered the surge in equities this week? Well, as regular viewers know, on Tuesday we saw a monetary stimulus package from the central bank, and we also saw signals of trillions in fiscal support in the pipeline. Then, of course, on Thursday, the Politburo, comprised of the ruling Communist Party's 24 most senior officials, including Xi Jinping himself, vowed to strengthen fiscal and monetary policies and pledged to strive to achieve the annual goal. There was also, crucially, support voiced for the property sector. Speaking at the Asia New Vision Forum 2024 in Singapore, Anna Feng, founding partner and CEO of venture capital firm Jin Fund, said that China's latest economic stimulus package is, quote, "great news," end quote, for later stage startups, as many IPO hopefuls that were marooned when Beijing tightened listing rules earlier this year could expect a return of capital as the market regains confidence. Feng said that the best thing that could happen now is that, quote, "the public markets will have a nice comeback, which will finally let middle and late stage investors start investing again. This year, Jin Fund actually has the most number of IPOs we've ever had," end quote. Some investors are also just rushing in amid a fear of missing out. However, others are more cautious. Gary Tan, portfolio manager at Allspring Global Investments, said that this week's measures are unlikely to lead him to shift his underweight position on China. Quote, "We think it will take a fundamental change in China's deflation outlook and the China property market for investors to commit new funds into China," end quote. Indeed, Tan correctly points out that the only change this week is Beijing signaling more support, but the deflationary environment, the local fiscal pressures, household consumption weakness, and critically the housing sector situation all remain deep structural issues. None of this has changed, and thus neither have the fundamentals. US-based Bloomberg reports that many used the opportunity this week and leading up to this week to cash out of Chinese stocks, writing that internet investing firm Proas NV has sold its entire stake in online travel agency Trip.com in a $743 million block trade. Chinese search engine Baidu Inc. later sold $534 million in the company's American depository shares. Meanwhile, an interesting development worth noting is that in the first hour of trading on Friday, Shanghai's stock exchange was marred by glitches in processing orders and delays. The Shanghai Stock Exchange is investigating the reasons for the delays. The Shanghai Composite Index stayed roughly unchanged from 10:10 a.m. for about an hour, even as the Shenzhen Composite gained 4.4% over the period. As trading resumed, the Shanghai Index surged. Now, as we discussed yesterday, the Thursday statement from the Politburo is a powerful signal of support for the economy generally, and for properties specifically. But after years of refusing to prop up the housing bubble and reverse deleveraging, why is the party signalling a course change now? Quote, The multi-trillion RMB question is, why did Xi seemingly suddenly decide to approve a series of stimulative policies this week? Has the economy gotten so bad that the political, security and social stability risks were becoming so pronounced that he was convinced he had to act? End quote. Now, I'm sure some regular viewers will tease me for having back-to-back quotes from these two, but I proceed nonetheless. Peking University professor of finance Michael Pettis observed on the moves this week, quote, "Sometimes you just have to trust the arithmetic. Since March, I have argued that Beijing had little choice but to engineer a large demand-side stimulus of at least 1 trillion RMB before the end of the year because, given trade and domestic investment constraints, more of the supply-side spending it had long favored wouldn't allow it to achieve the 2024 GDP growth target. Most China analysts disagreed on the grounds that Beijing was unalterably opposed to the idleness breeding trap of welfarism, and so would never initiate such a spending program. But I argued that the choice facing Beijing wasn't between welfarism and no welfarism. It was instead between welfarism and falling well short of GDP growth targets. It had become so obvious that the Chinese economy was constrained mainly by weak demand that I told all my clients that any such announcement would probably set off a stock market rally. From recent events, it now seems that Beijing might have finally chosen to implement a large demand-side stimulus, although we still don't have details, so we can't say for sure. Sure enough, the stock market has reacted positively, but excessively. Check out the rather shocking graph in the New York Times article, but while we needed a rise, I don't think a 16% surge in the CSI 300 in 1 week is at all a healthy stock market reaction. It just reinforces how highly speculative the markets are in China, and how volatile. But that's what we're stuck with. This violent surge seems to leave us where we were after the February rally. If it isn't sustained and prices start to fall again, it will demoralize investors and further undermine the credibility of the stock markets and the regulators. That is why I think this week's stock market performance may not be what the regulators hope for, and may put even further pressure on Beijing to follow through with a substantial demand-side stimulus. Not only is a demand-side stimulus the only effective way to boost economic activity enough before the end of the year to allow China to reach the GDP growth target, but Beijing also cannot allow this week's stock market rally to fizzle out yet again." End quote. Next up, today, Saturday, Australia's Department of Defence announced that Australia and the Philippines would conduct a joint maritime activity with Japan, New Zealand, and the United States in the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines, a region also claimed by the PRC. The government statement read, quote, "The maritime cooperation activity demonstrates our collective commitment to strengthen regional and international cooperation in support of a peaceful, stable, and prosperous Indo-Pacific." End quote. Of course, as regular viewers know, the joint exercise comes after a series of air and sea encounters between the Philippines and China over disputed areas of the South China Sea, home to one of the most important shipping lines in the world. China claims nearly all of the South China Sea, despite overlapping maritime claims by Brunei, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Vietnam. UK-based Reuters reports on Wednesday that naval vessels from New Zealand and Australia sailed through the Taiwan Strait, a move Australia's Department of Defence said showed the country's commitment to an open, stable, and prosperous Indo-Pacific. Unsurprisingly, Beijing soon after condemned the move. North of the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait is yet another region of escalating tensions, this one between the world's second and third largest economies, tensions which are rooted in history, nationalism, and ethnicity. Tensions which we will discuss next. But just quickly, if you're getting some value from today's episode, don't forget to hit the like button. It is just me making these episodes every day. It's a lot of work, but it's a tremendous pleasure to be able to do so. And if you'd like to see them shown to new people, liking, sharing, and subscribing is a tremendous help. Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are also in the description for those who want to help keep the channel financially sustainable. My thanks, as always, to everyone for helping with this ongoing support. Next up, now normally I try to keep all videos fact-based and data-driven, but for today I felt it would add some useful context to share a few brief anecdotal personal experiences. I hope you will forgive this personal indulgence. This week, Japan's State Minister for Foreign Affairs, Tsuge Yoshifumi, travelled to Beijing, where he met with China's Vice Foreign Minister Sun Weidong. The emergency meeting was to stabilize relations in the wake of the killing of a Japanese schoolboy in Shenzhen. We covered this at the time. This is, of course, the second likely but yet to be proven anti-Japanese targeted attack on children in China in recent months. Tsuge called on Beijing to find out the truth of the incident, clarify the motive, and crack down on, quote, baseless, malicious, and anti-Japanese, end quote, social media posts and comments, according to a statement from the Japanese Foreign Ministry. Anti-Japanese social media posts include claims that Japanese schools in the country are new colonies and centers for spying against China, even though most of these schools teach primary school children. Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson Ling Jian said during a briefing on Monday that the two sides recognized each other's efforts in handling the tragic incident and that China stands ready to continue building a constructive and stable relationship with Japan. Lin added that, quote, our tradition of welcoming all foreign friends with every sincerity and treating them as equals will not change, end quote, and that China does not, quote, teach its people to hate Japan, end quote. The statement was met with some derision online, even from Chinese domestically. Analysts have long observed strong anti-Japanese popular and elite views in China, views which Chinese nationalists and others justify due to the legacy of World War II. We will return to this shortly. The foreign ministers of Japan and China also met in New York this week to discuss the fatal stabbing and hostile messages about Japan posted on Chinese social media platforms. Japanese Foreign Minister Yoko Kamikawa said on Monday that she would strongly urge her Chinese counterpart Wang Yi, quote, to provide a clear explanation of the facts and ensure the safety of Japanese people, especially children, end quote. Before setting off for the United States on Monday, Kamikawa also said Japan would spend 43 million yen, $300,000 to boost security at Japanese schools in China. Some angry Japanese commentators complained that Chinese police should be better protecting them in the first place. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida has also demanded an explanation and urged China to ensure the safety of Japanese citizens in the country. Since the most recent stabbing, several Japanese companies have offered to move their employees out of China too. Panasonic Holdings Corp., for example, has offered to send their employees in China back to Japan at its own expense. China ranks first in terms of the number of overseas bases of Japanese companies, according to Japan's foreign ministry, with some 31,000 firms represented in the economy. In the aftermath of the stabbing, some Chinese nationalists argued the attack was justified, considering the atrocities committed during Japan's invasion of China during World War II. Professor Florian Schneider, a China scholar from Leiden University, said the antagonistic and xenophobic sentiments were promoted by Chinese officials, quote, in the service of patriotic education, end quote. He argued this week, quote, entire generations have grown up with nationalist interpretations that paint a bleak picture of Japan, and these impressions are perpetuated by museums, television entertainment, video games, and official commemoration activities. Some of this is politically motivated, as nationalism helps paint a picture of a China that has shaken off a century of humiliation at the hands of foreign powers. While the vast majority of people in China are of course able to understand the nuances of their nation's history, there are bound to be individuals that draw simplistic and toxic conclusions, end quote. This may be a charitable observation, however. Anecdotally, the number of times I've heard a hateful rant against Japanese people while living in China over the last 9 years would be in the hundreds. At times when, for my own safety, I've said that I'm Russian, I have also heard rants against Anglo-Saxons. The anti-Japanese sentiment feels deep and very mainstream, and at times completely confused. For example, earlier this month, a taxi driver bitterly complained to me about how the Japanese had destroyed the old summer palace in Beijing. When I informed him that the destruction of the old summer palace occurred during the so-called Second Opium War in October of 1860 by French and British troops, decades before China and Japan were ever in conflict, he told me that I did not know what I was talking about, and that the Chinese people would never forget. A common claim circulating online suggests that the Eight-Nation Alliance, which included Japan, inflicted further damage on the park in 1900. but historical evidence does not support this assertion. Indeed, earlier this month, 2 Japanese tourists encountered an aggressive confrontation with a Chinese influencer while taking photos at the Old Summer Palace, sparking a nationwide debate about racial bigotry. Hong Kong-based South China Morning Post recently published an article on the incident. We will end by examining some of it. Quote, "On September 7th, the 2 Japanese tourists and their Chinese interpreter were taking pictures when their view was obstructed by a Chinese influencer known as Asian Man. Asian Man has accumulated 326,000 followers on Douyin by sharing insights into his daily life since returning to China after earning a master's degree in economics in the UK." End quote. As an aside, we can see here that even highly educated and cosmopolitan Chinese can have these views. To share an anecdote from myself, the last unpleasant interaction I had, which was at a young professionals networking event in Shanghai, was from a young Chinese man with an MBA from the United States. He told me, in English, that I was a cancer on the Chinese economy and that I should get the F out of his country. The young man continued in this vein for several minutes. 3 other young Chinese standing next to me, who presumably have less experience than myself with such outbursts in China, were deeply shocked by the interaction. We continue with the South China Morning Post report. Quote, "In the video filmed by Asian Man, the interpreter can be seen asking him to move aside so that the Japanese tourists can take photos. 'As a Chinese, how dare you ask me to give way to Japanese people at the Old Summer Palace?' Asian Man angrily asked. Asian Man asserted that Chinese people should not assist Japanese visitors with their photographs. In defense, the interpreter said that all visitors have the right to take photos regardless of nationality. Despite this, Asian Man continued to confront them with offensive language, labeling the interpreter as a traitor. As the tourists and their interpreter attempted to leave, Asian Man followed them, filming with his phone. One of the Japanese tourists threatened to call the police, to which Asian Man retorted that Japanese people do not deserve to call the police in China. The group then sought assistance from a security guard at the site to resolve the conflict. The interpreter explained that the tourists were employees of a Japanese company in China. However, the guard claimed that Japanese people were not allowed into the Old Summer Palace. The interpreter said there was no such regulations and that the Japanese tourists had entered the park after buying tickets. "My opinion does not represent the management's opinion. However, I absolutely do not allow Japanese people to enter," the security guard said. He also supported Asia Man's stance, stating, "I hate the Japanese. I must give them a hard time." A staff member at the site told Hong Sing News that there are no restrictions for Japanese visitors. The incident quickly made headlines on mainland social media. One supporter defended Asian Man, saying, "He did nothing wrong. No one is obligated to step aside for others to take photos at a scenic spot." Many others criticized him, with one Weibo user commenting, "He lacks basic historical knowledge. The destruction of the Old Summer Palace has nothing to do with the Japanese. Even if it did, these tourists did nothing wrong." Another wrote, "This is using patriotism as an excuse to incite ethnic conflict, which constitutes racial discrimination. What Asian Man did was detrimental to China's international image. Foreign friends, please be assured that his actions do not represent all Chinese," said a third. At a press conference on September the 9th, a reporter from Japan's Asahi TV asked the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs for comments on the matter, noting concerns among Japanese people living in China. Chinese spokeswoman Mao Ning stated that she was not familiar with the incident and would not comment on personal statements. "China is an open and inclusive country, and we do not engage in discriminatory practices against any specific country," Mao said. As of now, Asia Man has deleted the video he posted on social media, and his accounts are no longer accessible online. It remains unclear whether he has received any warnings or penalties for his actions. End quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much everybody for watching. Have a good Saturday, have a restful weekend, and I will see you all on Monday.